Okay, we're ready when you are.
Okay. So I'm presenting Jason's thesis, which, as most of you probably know, but just in case you don't, it takes place during the Spanish Civil War. And he's focusing specifically on propaganda that the anarchists used and its effects on both their governance and on the individuals and their wills to fight. But before I get into that, I want to do a little bit of background on the Spanish Civil War. Takes place in 1936-37. By 1937, it's almost over. The anarchists have lost power, but it continues to last on for the next couple of years in the reprisals, in the kind of the messy ends that wars, unfortunately, almost always have. And it's a really interesting time period because this is almost a proto-World War II. You've got fascists on the one hand supported by the Italians, supported by the Nazis, against the anarchist communists who were supported by the Soviet Union and would have been supported by the Western powers, Britain, the United States, but they eventually decided not to intervene because this was still the period of isolationism and they wanted to let Europe sort out their own problems. So his thesis, like I said, is focusing primarily on propaganda, and it's looking at propaganda in two kind of respects. The first one is as a tool for motivating individuals, basically to fight for their causes. Like, he wants to look at all forms of propaganda, so posters, pamphlets, text, even radio broadcast, anything like that, and see what effects it had on the soldiers who fought in these militias for the CNTFIA, which is the National Confederation of Labor, and the Iberian Anarchist Federation. And so the hope is that by looking at these kind of documents, he can see what drove the soldiers to fight. And this kind of falls similar to the lines of, I believe it was Peirats. Am I saying his name right?
Peirats. Yeah.
Peirats, who looked at local factors. They wanted to get rid of the bipolarism of the conflict, saying that it wasn't just fascism versus anarchists fighting, that a lot of these people fought for local reasons, for, I fought to protect my family, I fought to protect my home, my country, where I come from, not just because I am an anarchist and they're fascists and we're destined to fight. And so in that line, this looking at propaganda as a tool fits in that same kind of pattern, because it's not just saying these were anarchists, these were fascists, it's saying maybe there was something else motivating these people. Perhaps it was, perhaps it was the pamphlet that they read talking about the glory of Spain or of the cause. Maybe it was something other than these just pure ideological beliefs. And the second avenue that he's looking at with propaganda, first being the motivator, second being as a tool for governance. Because these were anarchists, fundamentally, they don't have a large, organized government. You think of fascists, you think of communists as very organized, very structured, and run governments. Anarchists, on the other hand, don't have this kind of setup. So propaganda was their main tool to kind of make sure that people got where they needed to go, or make sure that everything was running the way it should be. So, and this is actually a really unique kind of avenue to take on it, because there have been studies of propaganda as tools of governance. Again, thinking about communism, think about Nazis, all of their propaganda has been studied, ad infinitum. There have been many studies about that, but as anarchists go, this is one of the few very self-defined anarchist movements, that have been around, and also the fact that they are using propaganda, it's something that's never really been done before, and so he's trying to focus on that. And so in that field, he feels that he's kind of bringing together these two areas of research in the field of the Spanish Civil War. The first one is the one that focuses on the larger picture, the idea of governance, which is you talk about the fascists, you talk about the communists, and then fight. Yeah, fascists and communists fighting along with the anarchists. He's focusing on that with propaganda, and then he's bringing that together with the kind of the personal reactions, which originally was what he was going to focus on, kind of the individual reactions and the reprisals, how people thought about their own experiences, and he's going to try to unite them under this overarching idea of propaganda. So I think that was about it.
Yeah, that summed it up really nicely. Definitely the background information at the beginning is useful, because I tend to kind of forget that not everybody knows as much about the Spanish Civil War as I do. I guess for my thesis, I'm very interested in, it's like a very simple kind of cause and effect relationship. Like, I've seen all this very interesting propaganda. These posters, which are always red and black. It's like the colors of these main parties that I use the word govern very lightly because they didn't really govern Barcelona because they were anarchists. The anarchists say that, well, nobody is better than anybody else and nobody governs, you know. They had these councils and things like that, but, you know, their war effort was constructed mainly by these militias, which are composed of volunteers. They had no officers. They had, like, you know, they would nominate their own leaders, and there was no, like, form of military discipline. If you wanted to leave, you just left. So I'm really curious in this kind of causal relationship between, like, how did the anarchist leadership mobilize propaganda in the form of, like, pamphlets, newspapers, bulletins, and posters that were just, you know, all these things that were circulated in the public sphere, intended for everybody. How did they use that to direct their, you know, war aims, and how did that, again, you know, affect these people who joined the militias themselves? I mean, was it like part of their motivation to fight? In that vein, I'm really curious in finding primary sources in that regard, because I really do want to study the men of the militias themselves. You know, I want to find, like, diaries from them. I found a couple sources actually which are really interesting, but, you know, look through those and try and glean between the lines and see, are they echoing the same themes that I've seen in this propaganda? Like, you know, obviously they're not going to say, oh, I saw this propaganda and it made me want to go fight. Maybe they'll talk about, like, a poster, like a movie they saw. But, you know, it would be really interesting to see, oh, here's this person saying this thing that I clearly saw in this newspaper circulated around this time. So obviously, like, their ideas were really effective in, you know, kind of shaping their, you know, military members towards their, you know, viewpoints. It's really interesting as well because, you know, because of their anarchist, like, ideology, they didn't have, I mean, they reject formal governance as a thing, you know, but they still had to administer Catalonia as a region. They still had to control, like, a front line in, like, a major conflict. So that's very interesting because, you know, in most other societies or governments and things like that, you see propaganda as a tool to kind of, like, shape people's viewpoints, like, towards adherence to the law. Like, you have this law, you have this, like, you know, discipline that's instituted. The propaganda seeks to put people towards that. In this case, what I hope to argue is that the propaganda itself was sort of the law. Like, it was what shaped them towards this cause. It wasn't, like, you know, just a secondary, like, backing up thing. It was the primary means of governance, essentially.
Questions? Comments? I wanted to ask you about the time frame for this study. Because there's clearly the period of the war itself.
Right.
But you've opened the door, in a sense, by way of your interest in reprisals. And I wonder how long you imagine the story of reprisals
Sure.
to
I guess, I mean,
forward in time.
right. I mean, the primary time focus for this study is going to be from, like, 1936 to May of 1937, which is essentially when, like, the Communist Party of Spain, you know, seized Catalonia. Essentially, they kind of, like, invaded Barcelona. There was, like, you know, fighting in the streets. As, you know, they've turned it like a civil war within the civil war almost, and that kind of ended, like, the governance of, like, the groups that I want to study. So I guess in terms of, like, the reprisals I'd like to study, I mean, I'm very curious as to whether people still living in Barcelona who had been part of the anarchist cause after that, like, well, you know, how did the propaganda, you know, it'll have a lasting effect towards their view of the communists. Like, were there communists, like, reprisals against the communists, I guess. That's sort of kind of a secondary part of what I want to study, I suppose. But the primary time frame I'm looking at is the anarchist hegemony in Catalonia and Barcelona in particular. You know, when they were ruling, how did they essentially, like, govern through propaganda, and how did that affect their kind of war aims? Yeah.
Just have a quick question. Was the anarchist government and their militia groups, were they unusually effective considering that they are anarchists? Like,
yeah, particularly like, at the beginning of the war, when it started, they were one of the most, like, effective, like, fighting groups, essentially. It was really interesting, you know, when the government split, most of the military members joined the kind of, like, fascist rising. So the Republican government was very suspicious of its own military and had to disband them. So, you know, the first couple months of the war, there was no official Republican military, and most of the fighting, you know, fell to these militias, essentially. There are a couple of very famous militias that I want to study. One in particular is about this guy. He was probably the most, like, famous anarchist leader. His name was, like, Buenaventura Durruti, and he, you know, he's very, very well known, and he was actually killed very early in the war, like, fighting in Madrid for the cause. And I'm very interested, kind of as well, to see, like, was there a theme of heroism in, like, their propaganda? Like, did they use his, like, kind of, they turned him a martyr almost, you know? Did they use him as an example to kind of, like, motivate others to fight?
Are you, like, fluent in Spanish?
I'm not fluent. I'd say
Very good.
proficient, I guess. Yeah, I can read pretty well, yeah. It's still difficult to work with sources like this. Like, it takes me longer to get through it, and I have to use a
Yeah.
dictionary a lot of the time. But
Do you think? Do you think it?
it's definitely, yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly easier if the sources were in English. But I actually, I really look forward to that, and I think that the more I dive into the Spanish sources, like, the more my reading ability is going to increase, just by the sheer fact of, having to improve my vocabulary every time I don't know a word. But at a certain, as much as it is a setback, it does force me to look at these documents much more closely as well. Because I may not understand them totally, it forces me to read them extremely closely.
See any sources of propaganda from the other side, like the anarchists, or is that something?
Oh yeah, I mean there's propaganda all over the conflict. It's really interesting. They take very different themes though. The anarchist propaganda is very much one. I mean, very typical of what you'll see of the time period. Like, if you look at any sort of socialist or communist propaganda, it has these very strong-looking men and the hammer and sickle, and they're always it's either working or they're rushing off to the front with their guns to go fight. Whereas if you look at the fascist propaganda, they termed it Franco termed it the crusade essentially. It's very religious actually. They said that it was Catholicism fighting against the Red Terror essentially. They termed them as these radical Reds almost. So they're very different thematically. I don't know how much I'm very interested in the fascist propaganda. I don't know how much it really pertains to this, maybe, but yeah,
Thank you very much. I will keep you at the helm and let you present Sam.
Okay, yeah, so I'll present Sam Cesis now. He's tentatively titled it Just Two Men in a Canoe, which I thought was a very excellent title. As I'm sure you all know, he's going to study the Lewis and Clark expedition. At the beginning of his prospectus, he says, well, the expansion is long since over, the American frontier is closed, we have achieved manifest destiny. Why is it still relevant to study that? He points to a couple landmark works from the 20th century that sort of reopened this dialogue, probably the most important of which being Turner's Frontier Thesis, which kind of posited that the American frontier was the single most important causative force in creating the American nation and the idea of the American identity. And he says that and other works made this kind of study of the American frontier very relevant again for the dialogue and the historiography of the American nation's development. So in that vein, his thesis seeks to kind of better understand the development of America kind of in a larger sense. He says that for the most part in most works regarding Lewis and Clark, it's regarded as a classic tale of success. It's two heroes going off on the frontier by themselves, adventuring through the unknown lands. They're the American heroes, they're explorers. He wants to challenge that narrative, essentially. He doesn't really buy into that. He says that, in fact, the expedition was largely a failure. He kind of posits that in two ways. The primary goal of the expedition, at least in terms of their funding from Congress, was to find the Northwest Passage. Simply, they didn't find it. I mean, there is no Northwest Passage. They failed in that regard. That's one simple one. But the most interesting part I think he wants to study is how it affected Native American policy. He's going to look at Thomas Jefferson's documents regarding that. He talks about Jefferson had this grand vision for the West and how he was going to civilize the Native Americans by sending out traders who would trade with them and lead them into debt, and then they would sell their land, and then once they sold their land, they would have to rely on agriculture as a means for survival, which he looks to John Locke as having said that agriculture is the basis of Western civilization. So Jefferson has this whole grand plan for how to civilize the Native Americans, kind of bring them into the fold. Unlike many of his other contemporaries, he didn't view them as an other. He viewed them as just as intelligent as white Europeans and totally capable of being assimilated into the American society. So the second part of calling this expedition a failure is seeing how it affected Native American policy and how it essentially didn't adhere to Jefferson's ideal, how it kind of kept them as this other, and didn't allow for their proper assimilation into American society. In that vein, in terms of looking at sources, he wants to compare the diaries, the letters of Lewis and Clark themselves, as well as their other crew members, things like that, with Jefferson's writings as well. He really wants to see, what was Jefferson's grand vision, how was that articulated to Lewis and Clark, and what did they exactly go about doing the expedition, and how it was portrayed afterwards that led to kind of the failure of that idea. Kind of in this way, he wants to demystify the memory of the West. Again, I mean, the classic narrative of Lewis and Clark is that they're American heroes, they're going off on this mythic adventure. He wants to totally challenge that and say, well, this wasn't necessarily the case. That does kind of fit into certain scholarship. that's kind of come out recently since the bicentennial celebrations. He points to that kind of as a reopening of dialogue on the issue. However, most of the primary work they've established Lewis and Clark's reliance on Native Americans, interactions with them as different than the traditional narrative, but they haven't looked at that afterwards. They haven't really looked at its direct ramifications on Native American policy at all. They've maybe examined it in the moment of the expedition, but they haven't seen what were the lasting effects of the expedition on Native American policy, which he posits were overwhelmingly negative and contrary to Jefferson's idea. So yeah, again, he's going to focus on these primary sources from Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark, really compare them in that idea. And in that way, his thesis is going to be constructed kind of in three different distinct parts. The first kind of chapter or section is going to be analysis of Jefferson's vision, say what was the goal of the expedition, what did Jefferson want from this in regards to Native American policy as well as finding the passage, things like that. The second section will focus on the journals themselves of Lewis and Clark and their crew members, and kind of fit that into Jefferson's narrative and posit how exactly that was a failure, how it didn't achieve what Jefferson was that he wanted to achieve. And the third section is going to focus on kind of the scope of that failure in terms of the ramifications on Native American policy, how did the expedition's failure affect Native American policy going forward, and what were the the deleterious effects of that.
Cool.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, just quick clarification before we jump into it. I know there were more than 2 people in a canoe. They had a crew. They had a barge. They had a lot of help. Again, tentative title, but that kind of gets to this idea of demystification that Jason mentioned, which was brought up a lot of the things that we hear about the West, which this is going to sound somewhat repetitious to Emily, who took a Western history class last semester, which a lot of my ideas for this come from. But a lot of what we know about the West is kind of mythological. We get it from Westerns, we get it from Buffalo Bill Cody, all of these ideas, and that clouds our vision of it. We think of it as a kind of romanticized past, and that doesn't let us see kind of the negative effects of this, which were the removal and extermination of hundreds of thousands of people and their way of life. And so my kind of hope with this thesis is that it won't unfortunately be able to look at that, because before we can actually, before we can accurately analyze the effects that we had, we have to first get a clear picture of it, and that requires this demystification process. So I'm looking at, this kind of crowning achievement which has been written about in somebody like Devoto in the 1950s wrote In the Course of Empire, which focused on U.S. history as a history of expansion, and Lewis and Clark was the seminal piece. This was the shining moment for U.S. history. And I'm taking that and I'm going to say, no, I don't think it was. They didn't really achieve what they wanted to. This was, they failed on both accounts of opening the West to American traders and of, finding the Northwest Passage, although admittedly wasn't their fault, doesn't exist. But I'm going to first, by hopefully showing Western history as not this kind of glorified, nostalgic past, that will allow for further scholarship to then say, to then more accurately look at the results. Okay, yeah, it's been known that the removal of the Native Americans has been kind of a dark spot on American history, but I don't think to this point the average person, or maybe even the average scholar, fully understands the impact and the enormity of this destruction. So that's kind of my hope for what happens with this thesis and then afterwards.
Questions?
This might be a slight aside, but do you agree or disagree with Turner, or do you not have a strong stance?
I agree that when Turner wrote his thesis, it was based on, I don't want to say abstract truth, but it was based on good observations and good theory. I think now it might be different. We've been separated from the era of Western expansion for a century plus. I would say the Cold War for most people, and now the War on Terror, is a bigger shaping factor in what makes the average American more capitalism rather than Western expansion. But at the time of writing, I think he was pretty spot on. Yeah.
So Lewis and Clark, what year did they?
That was 1804 to 1806.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Are you gonna write? I'm just curious. Are you gonna write about sort of ideas of expansion at the time?
Yeah, that's
Or
gonna.
like sort of the more political.
The ideas of, I mean, where I'm going to get into expansion is within Jefferson's kind of vision, because he had this very logical, very drawn out, very, Enlightenment thinker idea of expanding into the West, where he'd divide up the nation into like these very square chunks of states, and people would move in, and there'd be a very strict pattern for statehood. So that's what I'm going to talk about as terms of expansion into the West. The reality of that is, of course, people were moving into the West without government help. They were just expanding because, hey, they wanted the free land and they couldn't see anyone living there. But I can't get into that just in terms of scope of my thesis. Like, it's going to be hard to accurately assess what's actually happening, plus what Jefferson wanted, plus what happened with the expedition. So I've had to kind of limit kind of what I'm looking at.
One more follow-up.
Go for it.
So do you think that, because I'm also writing about the West a little bit, and the image of the West remains a very powerful thing in American culture. Do you think Lewis and Clark was sort of the beginning of that, or was that a little bit later with like mass culture and like dime novel, or like what I'm saying, like that the kind of cowboy West as freedom and American exceptionalism and all that?
Right. It's interesting because it changes with time. What happens with Lewis and Clark doesn't really get talked about until the centennial, until 100 years after, because then it culminates with Turner's Frontier thesis, which was a few years earlier. But in the closing of the Frontier, it culminates with all these ideas that made everyone think about Western expansion as a whole. Before that, though, you look at the 1870s, 1880s, then that's still being, mythologized by the American population, because that's when you have cowboys and Indians, they're fighting it out. You've got like the Plains Wars take place in the 70s. Buffalo Bill Cody comes by after that. Like, those things are the start, and even earlier are the start of this kind of mythical West. But after 1900s, thereabouts, then you've got Lewis and Clark as the beginning of it, because people go back and say, okay, Western history was very important. Where did it start?
I see. Yeah. Cool.
Well, thank you very much.
That's right.